So in terms of our attachment, we can see really it's described as the sort of bond that an infant has with a primary caregiver. So, often can be a parent, and how this bond actually really is important, especially in influencing not necessarily the course of the child's life, but their development, especially in infancy, obviously, but also how there are almost repercussions of this attachment that are evident later on in life, beyond what you can kind of consider as the attachment period. So you may have gone over this before, you may have watched videos of it in class, but Ainsworth, essentially this researcher who had these sort of experiments and described as this strange situation where an infant is kind of faced with different environments that obviously involve the primary caregiver, and the attachment formed between them is kind of observed. So again, you may be familiar with this, but you want to kind of think of behaviors that are demonstrated between the infant, when the primary caregiver is around, when they're not around, and what behaviors are shown, and that will kind of point to how the relationship is between the infant and the caregiver. So we think about this especially happening in infancy, as I mentioned, and how that will obviously affect the infant and their psychological development, and then how that in turn affects how that infant, once they've grown older, how they interact with their environment and interact with other people as well. So these are these are some of our attachment things that we're kind of thinking about. Secure attachment is kind of our objective, what we would like to reach, because this one essentially shows the greatest sort of positive development, you could say. So with secure attachment, again, we describe it as being the one that's sort of good, but it's not that 99% have it, about 65 have it. So the majority, but kind of just. So it's kind of an even mix between the infant is dependent on their caregiver and they feel as though they can trust them, but they're also curious about the world. They also want to explore the world and they're happy to do so, if that makes sense. So again, we're thinking of this kind of seesaw analogy. You really want to have this mix of both in terms of curiosity about the world and not being almost reclusive, you could say, but this idea that they are still able to trust their caregiver and depend on them, but not too much. Some of the other types of attachment, there's insecure attachment. So this can kind of break into insecure avoidant attachment and insecure resistant attachment. So this is kind of seen when there's sort of less of an attachment between the infant and the caregiver, and it's characterized by almost odd behaviors by the infant. So with avoidant, we're thinking of, if you think about avoidant versus resistant, I know they're kind of similar, but avoidant is more so almost not recognizing or not really knowing the caregiver. So as you can see here, they treat them like a stranger. So, in the strange situation, it may be that when the caregiver returns or when the caregiver is in the room, the infant isn't really bothered by it. Perhaps they disregard the parent. They don't acknowledge them. Again, they don't show that dependence in them. Insecure resistant attachment is sort of an odd one. So when the caregiver leaves the room, the infant is unhappy. So again, showing a sign of connection between the caregiver, but then when the caregiver has returned, they're not almost happy to see them, if that makes sense. So it's almost a little bit contradictory, this idea of being unhappy when the caregiver is gone, but not being, satisfied or not being happy when the caregiver has returned. And it can be shown by some kind of odd behaviors in that sense, this idea of that resistance. Disorganized attachment is kind of the fourth one, and this was actually developed a little bit later. And this is one you might see more of, especially in year 12 when you talk about mental health. So it's, just very contradictory behaviors to the caregiver's presence. So at times they might be very, very attached, not wanting to leave. At times they might be very resistant, kind of almost, a combination between a resistant and avoidant, that idea of, wanting to leave, not being consoled, almost like frightened by the caregiver. Hence the term disorganized. And this is one that's relatively negative, and it can cause sort of like, I don't want to say issues, but kind of negative aspects of development that you can see in later life. So again, in year 12, you talk about how it might predispose these individuals to developing certain mental health disorders and things like that. So it's this idea that it often, although this is an infancy, when these infants, grow older, you can see certain traits that are expressed. They have sort of high levels of anxiety. It's this idea of not having this sort of trust in the world or in other people. So often their relationships can struggle a little bit. So there's that kind of impact that you see not only in infancy, but in later life. And this is why, you talk about it in this context of psychological development, like the study design dot point, this idea of how attachment, so a period in infancy, influences the brain at a young age and how that can kind of carry on throughout later life as well. Okay.